Hi everyone, my name is Messdaghi and I'm so happy to be here with you today. Hacker Rights today, so that's pretty exciting, right? So before we begin, I just want to first tell everyone that this talk is completely dedicated to all the hackers who've been scared to disclose, to all the hackers who've been prosecuted for trying to do something good or doing their actual job, like they're actually hired to do these things, and to all the people who are in the fight to bring rights for hackers. So this talk is completely dedicated to those, and also this talk I just want to give a big thank you to a few people. So Meet Elazari, Casey Ellis, Bo Woods, and Harley Gager. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be knowing as much as I do about the lack of having rights as hackers. So for those that do not know who I am, my name is Messdaghi once again, and I'm the VP of Strategy over at Point3 Security. But my pretty much job in my everyday life is being an InfoSec advocate and also an activist, meaning I don't just talk about it, I also take action. I am also the president and co-founder of WOSEC, which is Women of Security, and also the founder of We Are Hackers, formerly known as Women Hackers. And when I'm not doing that, I also do a podcast with Alyssa Miller and Phil Wiley called the ITSP magazine, The Uncommon Journey, and also run a hacker book club with Angela. And basically we read books every month, read a new book, and every week at 5 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday, we gather around and talk about the book, but also those that are mentioned in the book, and the author does attend our sessions, which is fantastic because you can actually ask all the other questions that are between the lines of the words. So it's a lot of fun and anyone can join. One thing that's not on there is that I'm also the co-founder of Hacking is Not a Crime with Brian. He is my co-founder, and we'll dive a little bit more about hacking is not a crime in this talk, so you have a better understanding of what we're trying to do to help out the hacker community. If you have any questions about me at all, about what I do in InfoSec or outside of InfoSec, you can find all of that on my website at chloemessdaghi.com. My Twitter and Instagram, my DMs are always open, but feel free to follow too. All right, now let's dive into the good stuff. The real reason why you guys are here. We're going to talk about the current landscape. And I know this is a really scary subject, but we're going to do this together, and I'm hoping that I can make you laugh once in a while, even though my jokes are terrible most of the time. But let's do this. So first things first, you may have remembered the Equifax breach. Well, it impacted 147 million Americans. But did you know about 6 months before the breach occurred, a security researcher, or like I like to use the term hacker, reported this vulnerability to Equifax, but it was ignored. And so it wasn't fixed. And so when that breach made major headlines, the upsetting part was that this could have been avoided if they just listened to what was being disclosed. Okay. Thanks, Suri. All right, we'll keep going on this. The other thing is Capital One. So Capital One in general, if you did hear about this breach back in the day, was that the federal complaint, it showed that the breach took places across March and April 2019. But Capital One was not aware of this at all until a security researcher, once again, also known as a hacker, basically reported this situation that he or she saw on July 17th. And July 17th is when a public GitHub page was displaying something that looked awfully like private data for Capital One. So the one thing is to note is that if the security researcher never actually notified Capital One, they would have not known that this was out there for, you know, however long. And that's one of the things that we have to talk about today, is that what happened if no one actually reported the breach? And the reality of it is that it happens all the time. Because right now, one thing you should know about is that 60% of researchers don't report vulnerabilities. And this came from a discussion that Meet Elazari was doing when she was researching about the possibilities of having safe harbor for the hacker community. Now, one of the things with that you need to also understand is that it wasn't just her research about 60% of researchers don't report vulnerabilities, but is to note that the reason why is because they're afraid of being prosecuted. another report that came out was HackerOne. So HackerOne came out a report in 2018 that stated that 1 out of 4 hackers are afraid to disclose a vulnerability if they don't have vulnerability disclosure policies. But those that did end up reporting the vulnerability ended up doing it through, social media channels. And the one thing to note is that those that run those social media channels are usually marketing. So marketing doesn't really have communication too much with security, so they probably don't know what to do with it. However, they do see PR situations forming. So the thing is that 1 out of 4 that do report it, and they send a DM through LinkedIn or through Twitter, it ends up becoming a really, really difficult situation. Because what ends up happening is it's either ignored, which, that's way better than the other one, which is being misinterrupted. And the one thing you need to know about that is that then there becomes the threats, the legal threats that does occur. So remember that 60% of researchers don't report vulnerabilities because they're scared of being prosecuted. It's very much a reality because right now there is no laws that protect you. So why are hackers scared? Besides the constant fear of being prosecuted, the other thing you need to note about the hacker community is that even when we try to disclose something, sometimes it takes hours, days, weeks, and then we get to a point where, is it even worth it? Because it's going to put me in jeopardy regardless, but I want to do my job, which is the reason why I'm in this field still, is that I want to protect people. That's why I do what I do. It's because curiosity, of course, but also I like to protect people. And so that is the thing we need to think about, is the fact that hackers are scared because of outdated laws, and the lack of having rights is the other one. When trying to disclose something, it's a nightmare. And so that's why we need to understand this situation a little bit further. Because the thing that you need to understand at this very time is that the laws that are used to prosecute hackers in the US, the ones you have to worry about is the fact that they themselves are so outrageously out of date that it hurts you, but it's being used by companies. So companies are using it to prosecute hackers. It's not really federal government anymore. Since 2013, the DOJ has been doing whatever they can to protect ethical hackers. But the thing is, at the end of the day, it's happening across our country, and it's happening in local counties, also state. But big companies are the #1 abuser of this law called the CFA. Now, if you don't know the CFA, we will dive into it, but it's the Computer Fraud Abuse Act. It is the law used to prosecute hacking, even though it does not state hacker or hacking anywhere in it. But the thing you need to note is about this case. So this is an example of how a company can abuse and use a hacker. So the DJI, as you know, is a really, really well-known manufacturer of droids. The things that you need to understand about this one is that, so Kevin, he basically came across a bug bounty program that was run by DJI, meaning it was run by them in-house, not through like BugCrowd, HackerOne, no third party. So that's already letting you know there might be a problem here, because managing a bug bounty program is really, really hard. You need to have at least one person to manage it all, unless you work with those platforms. Now, there were signs throughout the whole thing at the beginning that this could be a bad thing, but DJI, they created their own bug bounty program, and Kevin, he saw the scope, and he wanted to make sure that that scope is correct. So he sent an email to them, and it took them 2 weeks, get this, 2 weeks to respond saying, yes, that is all in scope. Even though it was just something that's already on their website, what's in scope, it took them 2 weeks to confirm what's already on their website. Boom, that is your major red flag that this could be a problem. The fact it took 2 weeks, that means they're not managing this right. Anyway, so then he then proceeds to submit his disclosure, and it ended up being him getting, well, an award of $30,000 for his finding. And when it came to the contract for him to sign to receive the funds, it offered absolutely zero protection for him. At that moment, Kevin had to make the decision of, do I risk it all for $30,000? Or do I walk away from $30,000 knowing that at least I will be safe from being prosecuted, if ever? And so he did probably the most logical choice, which was not take the money. He didn't take the money, but DJI immediately saw him as a threat because he didn't want to take the money or sign the contract. They were worried that this could become a really, really bad PR situation for them if he were to disclose it publicly. So what they did was that even though he basically was like, okay, fine, you guys fix that vulnerability, I'm not taking your money, walks away, moves on with his life, he gets something which is basically a lawsuit saying that he went out of scope. And even though he confirmed, okay, he had a paper trail, he confirmed it, that he was within scope, that basically that he broke the CFAA, the Computer Fraud Abuse Act. So he himself then was like, okay, fine, you want to play this game? I didn't want to do this way. I didn't want to be dirty. I didn't want to disclose anything here, but here you go. So he puts on a blog everything. I mean, all the communications he's ever had with DJI, and you can look through it. And some of the responses from DJI itself are within the chain of the email, which is hilarious to read and at the same time really scary to read because they legitimately just called him out saying he is a problem. He's going to be a PR nightmare when he said he wasn't going to sign that contract. So the takeaway from that story, you should know, is that even when you're doing the right thing and you're doing all the right things, companies will still take advantage of you for PR purposes. Now, the other thing is to note that sometimes it's also when you are hired and you work for a company that you can also be prosecuted, such as the coal fire case that happened last year. If you don't know, is that in September of last year, the Iowa State basically asked coal fire to do some penetration testing to see if, if the staff could gain access to sensitive data or equipment. So 2 coal fire employees then proceeded to try to get into the Dallas courthouse, but they found the door was actually open. So then they decided to close the door to check to see if it would lock and if an alarm would go off. And so when they attempted to open it, the alarm did go off, which is great. That means they have security there. The problem is that at that moment, of course, they have to follow protocol. And the protocol is that they wait for the police to show up and they have their papers showing that they were hired to look into this situation. Now, most of the police were like, oh, that's really cool. How did you do that? Oh, that's such a cool thing that you do. The bad thing is that a local sheriff showed up and was like, no, you're going to jail. So they actually had to spend a night in jail because of basically the sheriff wanted to play his own rule book. You should note that the charges were later dropped this year in January. But the thing is, it's another example of even when you are hired and doing what you're doing all the right things, you can still have to deal with this situation. Because the reality is that still to this day, everyone knows that you need the hacker community to help out, to protect you, to become more secure. But the reality is that we're also battling this idea of what is a hacker versus an attacker. And the unfortunate bit is that most of the public perception still sees hackers as devious people. And thus, organizations and also program managers are a little bit afraid to work with the hacker community because they are afraid of us. But the other thing is they need to understand is that we are terribly frightened of them because they have more protection than we do when we try to disclose something. So even though they're like, oh, please disclose something to us, we're also scared to disclose something to you. But also a lot of organizations still don't have disclosure policies, and this becomes a huge problem. Now, I've set the scene for you to know what the current landscape looks like, and we're going to go a little bit more in detail, but I know this is a really scary subject. So here are some puppies to lift your spirits. There is a cat in there, and I would say it's kind of like a Where's Waldo game, but in reality of it, it's pretty obvious where it is. But you know, for all the cat lovers, here you go. And I'm sorry for all the dogs instead, but I am a dog lover and I have 2 Shibas at home. So, and they're not on here. All right, let's continue. Deep breath, you guys. So I'm going to dive a little bit more into that public perception situation about the hacker community. Now, the one thing you should note is that the public perception of us is based around imagery, but also language. But the thing you should note is that anytime you type in criminal hacker versus ethical hacker, you get the exact same images: dark, hooded figures. And sometimes they wear a ski mask, which is very interesting. But the thing is to understand is that because of these images that are out there, the public doesn't know that there's 2 very, very different groups here. There's hackers and there's attackers. And this might be the good time to explain to you the differences. And what it does, it comes down to one part. What is the goal or the intent of the person? They use the same skills, both parties, to get what they need to get to, but their ill intent is different. So ill intent is for those that are attackers. Attackers' goals are to collect money or data. That is their goal, is to have some sort of power, in a sense, to utilize and abuse it for their own needs. Now, when it comes to a hacker, their intent is to serve and protect, meaning wanting to help out and be the everyday heroes behind the scenes. So the intent is very different from 2 parties. And though sometimes we like to compare the 2 parties as one is a locker, the other one is a burglar, because the reality of it is that they use the exact same skill sets to get to their goal. But the one thing you should take away from that is that one does it with permission or doesn't, and also doesn't exploit. So for example, if I'm looking at vulnerabilities, I'm going to do what's within the scope, and I'm only going to exploit if you give me permission. Now, the other thing is that if you are an attacker, you're not doing any of that. What you're doing is, I'm going to find that vulnerability, I'm going to utilize that vulnerability, and I'm going to get to my goal. Now, another thing to think about is that the hackers are the ones that are out there trying to prevent the attackers from taking advantage and having their own gains. That is the differences of the 2. But if you see in those images, they look like the exactly same people. And this is a problem that we're facing, because it's not just images that's interfering here, but also the language as well. We still use the terms hackers instead of using the term attackers when we're talking about someone who's committed a criminal act. And this is the thing that we're dealing with, is that the media doesn't know. Or I want to have high hopes that they don't know that there's a difference. But the thing I want you to take away from this is that the language and images themselves, they impact us, because public perception basically allows us to have rights and not have rights. It's public perception that challenges us to be able to move forward, because they don't know. And how to spread that knowledge is the one thing that is the hardest thing to do, because that means we have to get certain parties to agree with us. But what I want to talk about right now at this point in this conversation is there's this thing called socially constructed beliefs. And a socially constructed belief is basically the idea that, well, it's not an idea, it's actually research, and it's a term that's used, but basically it's the idea that whatever that you look at or read or watch, you're taking in knowledge and information about how the world works. And so socially constructed beliefs are these beliefs that you have created based on your surroundings. This could be watching the news. This could be reading a book. This could be reading an article. This could be reading tweets. This could be having a conversation. The thing is that these beliefs that you have can become really strong, because it's letting you know how the world works. So you're processing information to see, how to play the game, the life game of how the world works. But the thing you need to note is that socially constructed beliefs can also be false. They can very much be false many times. And so it's really important to understand how these socially constructed beliefs play out when it comes to fear. And for those that know, every time I go talk, I do talk about the brain, because the brain is really cool. Because if we know human behavior, then we know how to work it. So let's first dive into the brain. Now, I want you to know is that socially constructed beliefs tend to be stored in your temporal lobe, which takes sensory information and inputs it into long-term working memories. So this is where you start understanding how the world works around you. But the thing to note is that within your temporal lobe itself, it's also where your amygdala lays. Now, the amygdala, you may have heard of it, it's a fight versus flight mechanism, but you maybe not know that it's also your mechanism that shouts stranger danger. In other words, who's like me, who's not like me? So if you never met someone who is a hacker, you would never know what their real story is, because the reality is everything that you know about the hacker community is stuff that you see in the news or in movies or in books or from other people gossiping. So the thing is that is why a lot of people are afraid of us. It's because of these socially constructed beliefs that we are criminals, because that's what's being told and shared all over the place. And because of that, they sort us as not like me, so stranger danger. Now, I want to take this a little bit further so you have a better understanding of how fear works. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about an example. So imagine when you're growing up that you turn on the TV and the person with pink hair you automatically will always assume is the criminal, because the person with pink hair always plays the criminal. Or even when you turn on the news, you see someone with pink hair and you know that person's guilty. Or anytime there's a criminal story out there, the person has pink hair. So you have this belief now that every single person that has pink hair is a possible danger, and it's not like you because you don't have pink hair and you don't talk to anyone with pink hair. So how would you know? So say, for example, you're walking down the street, and when you're walking down the street, there's someone with pink hair behind you. Now, at that point, you usually do is you cross the street, you clutch your bag a little bit closer, or you go into the closest store to get away because of this fear. But the thing to note about fear is that it has to be verified. So going back to the pink hair example, is that so when there's a person with pink hair behind you, your amygdala is setting off a signal saying, warning, warning, stranger danger, person with pink hair is behind you, criminal, be careful, you should take action. So the amygdala, which is completely subconscious by the way, then sends a signal to the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex of your brain works as a CEO. It basically uses logic and rationale to decide whether or not it is a threat or what actions to take if it is. It then would send a signal back to the amygdala to calm down or to react. Now, the prefrontal cortex at this moment, with a person with pink hairs behind you, the amygdala sends that message saying, warning, stranger danger, pink hair behind you. So the thing is that now at this point, you're thinking of your 3 actions that you usually take. Cross the street, clutch your bag, or go into a store. Now, but there's this one moment that you remember that you came across a YouTube video. And this YouTube video itself was someone with pink hair. And this person with pink hair is on camera basically saying how hard it is to be someone with pink hair. That everyone sees them as a criminal and that it hurts them because every time they're walking, sometimes they'll see people clutch their bag, cross the street because they're right behind them and they're afraid of them. And how much that hurts them, because not only does that criminal title come up every time the person walks into a room, the thing is that even that also prevents them from being able to do a lot of things, such as getting certain jobs or being able to go in a store without someone following them in the store, making sure they're not stealing something. The reality is that that story touched you in a sense that you realize, you ask yourself, I wonder if I ever did any of that. Or maybe you go through your mind and like, I think I have. Or wait, I definitely done that before. Oh my God, I'm a terrible person. So that's what will go through your mind when you see a video. Not everyone, but people that like to practice empathy and feel comfortable being wrong, which a lot of humans don't. We don't like to be wrong. We're insecure beings that are like all over this planet, and we don't like being wrong. But the reality is that that socially constructed belief of someone with pink hair as a criminal has now been questioned. So now let's go back to our example. So the amygdala sends a signal to prefrontal cortex saying, warning, warning, stranger danger. Person with pink hair, you have your 3 actions, which is cross the street, clutch your bag, go into a local store. But this other new one pops up, which is, hey friend, hey, remember you watched that video on YouTube and that story of the person with the pink hair and how it hurts that person every time they see them do those things that you're thinking about doing? Maybe you shouldn't act this time. Maybe you should just trust the stranger. And you take that one as going forward. Because let's be real, we don't want to be terrible people sometimes. And so you send a signal back to your amygdala saying, simmer down. We are not going to act on this. This person's not a threat. The only thing that's different between me and that person is just that they have pink hair. This is ridiculous. I don't believe into this socially constructed belief anymore. Boom. And that's the thing I want you to understand, is that right now, we all have the ability to question our socially constructed beliefs. And these socially constructed beliefs does hurt other people. And that's why it's important that we do every single day is question our beliefs, get outside of our comfort bubble to understand the other party. Because the reality is that we're not intermingling with each other enough. We kind of stay within our bubble. And it does make us feel safe and secure. It makes us feel like, okay, I'm not wrong, so I feel comfortable in my own skin. But the reality is that the more you know about the world that you live in, the more you don't know about the world you live in. And that's what we're dealing with right now, is that people don't know about hackers. They've never met them. They've never had heard their story. So how are they going to question the beliefs that they have of the hacker community? Because once we figure out how to change people's perception of us, that's when we start winning here. That's when we start getting to push for legislation changes. It's when we start getting companies to have disclosure policies. Because right now, where we're standing right now is that this has resulted in some serious situations here. That 94% of the Forbes Global 2000 list still doesn't have a vulnerability disclosure policy. Can you believe that? It's kind of ridiculous. So think of all the hackers out there that are disclosing vulnerabilities and they're either being ignored, and then later it becomes breaches for you and your personal data getting out there. This is the thing we need to be serious about and have companies understand, is that if you don't have vulnerability disclosure policies, you're opening the door for the attacker to do whatever they want, because the hacker who saw it earlier is scared to report it to you, or you threaten that person because they are trying to do the good thing here. And that 60% of hackers don't report those vulnerabilities because they're afraid of being prosecuted, because the public's idea of who we are has been life-threatening for many of us. Not just that, the laws right now are so out of date, and it prevents good hacking the same way that it prevents bad hacking, because they didn't know the difference, because they don't know these things. Especially back then, they really didn't know those things. Also, the prosecution of ethical hackers is a real situation that we're still dealing with to this very day. And not just that, because how the public views us, it doesn't also make us want to always be that person who's like, well, I will do everything legally correct. Because the thing is, at the end of the day, is that you see this with kids. If you tell a kid that they're terrible, that they're stupid, or that they basically are bullies, they do act it out because everyone believes that they are. So they just basically like, fine, then I will be that type. And this is one of the reasons why we have a good number of bad actors still. Because if we change the legislation how it is today, I'm pretty sure we'll get a good number of attackers switching over. Because the reality is, if I didn't have to be worrying about being prosecuted all the time and get paid for the stuff that I do, you are sure right that I would definitely want to make sure I'm on that side. Now, of course, there are folks out there in this world that don't feel guilt. So those ones we don't, they could stay as attackers. But the reality is we want the ones that feel guilty about what they do to bring them over. Now, I want to talk about worldwide legislation here, because the thing is that you need to know about this few things. So worldwide legislation, you'd find that there's anti-hacking laws, anti-circumvention laws, and acceptable use policy. Now, the thing to note about here is that, yes, this looks very US-centric, but there's a reason why. It's because the US set it up in a way that they started tackling the anti-hacking sphere, and so other countries followed. And that's what happens when you're kind of like a superpower, I guess. People will follow you in your direction. So the thing is the anti-hacking laws, so the Computer Fraud Abuse Act, we'll dive into that in the next slide. But the thing is to note is that it was enacted in 1984. What came about was that Ronald Reagan, he watched this movie called War Games, which we've all seen, and maybe some of us love it. But that movie made him scared out of his mind to a point where he was like, we gotta do something about these hackers. They're evil people. I gotta do something about this. And that's how the CFA was created. It was because he watched War Games. Remember those socially constructed beliefs? A movie can also do that too. So the CFA was created, and basically what it does is that if you basically access a computer without authorization or an excessive authorization, basically this could be used against you. And usually it happens anytime a researcher goes out of scope and the company wants to prosecute you. This is used to prosecute hacking, the CFA. We haven't really seen it in the DMCA at all, and to my knowledge, I don't know of any cases that have, but it does produce a chilling effect. And anti-circumvention laws are copyright laws, basically. Seeing reverse engineering as a breach of property. So that's why you have to still be a little bit careful and be aware of it. And then you have your acceptable use policy, which some of us know about, which is basically, think about this. How many of you guys ever actually read your terms and conditions, say for an Apple product? I did once. It was 50 pages long, and it definitely was written for an attorney to another attorney to understand it, which is the problem here. Because the reality is that hackers aren't attorneys, and usually. But the other thing is to note is that not only are hackers not attorneys, but some of us are English learners too. So yeah, we got that going on for us. So the thing is that miscommunication can happen all the time, and acceptable use policy could be way better if they broke it down into being more exact and less verbiage. So then the everyday person around the world could be able to understand it. So then they stay within scope and there is no miscommunication. But the thing you need to know is that all those laws that you just saw right before this slide are completely out of date. All right, this was before Y2K. We're in 2020. And yes, I do realize we're still in 2020. This is one hell of a year. But the thing is to note is that it's 2020, and that was in '84, the CFA. So it doesn't seem right that there has been no reform of this. Not just that, the thing you need to know is that there was no representation at all of the hacker community when that was being created. And that is something you need to know, is that when we don't have proper representation on any legislation, we have a problem. Because those parties that are impacted by that legislation that wasn't taken into consideration, or their sharing of how this was going to impact their lives, you have made a terrible legislation decision. Because the best legislation out there is when they take all the different parties and make sure they're in the same room to talk about what is needed at this time that could help everyone at that table. And that's the thing we didn't have. And unfortunately, I hate to be the breaker of like more bad news in this whole talk, but a lot of legislators don't know anything about cybersecurity. They don't even know a difference between a hacker or attacker. But the scary thing is a lot of them don't know about cybersecurity. And because they don't, that puts us in a very bad situation. Because laws are now being created or have been created that basically prevents good things from happening because they're trying to fix a bad situation from occurring. So the laws right now, they prevent good hacking in the same way they prevent attackers, and we need really good hacking. So I want to dive into the CFAA, and I do have plenty of notes, so you'll see my eyes going a little bit more south here. But the reality is that the CFAA is one of those things that needs a real reform at this time, because the Computer Fraud Abuse Act was basically passed in 1984 and is very out of date at this time. But it also offers prosecutors discretion to threaten huge potential fines and jail sentences for relatively underserving violations of the computer policy. First, the CFAA, as written, punishes exceeding authorized access to a protected computer, a phrase very vague enough to inspire some broad interpretations. Another flaw in the CFAA is the redundant provisions that enable a person to be punished multiple times for the exact same crime. These charges can be stacked on top of one and another, resulting in much higher jail time, but also fines for the exact same violation. And we saw this with the Aaron SWARTZ case, which we'll dive into next. This also allows prosecutors to bully defense into accepting a deal in order to avoid facing a multitude of charges from a single solitary act. It also plays a significant role in sentencing. The ambiguity of a provision meant to toughen sentencing for repeat offenders of the CFA may in fact make it possible for defendants to be sentenced based on what should be prior convictions, but were nothing more than multiple convictions for the exact same crime. Once again, I want you to understand is the CFA it gives the right to sue for basic companies, gives the right to sue the hacker community. But also is to note that you have more to fear from companies than states and also your federal justices. So, but just note that states are still a problem, but companies are your #1 fear. And I want to talk about Aaron SWARTZ because Aaron SWARTZ is an example of how much the CFA is needed a reform. So if you don't know about his story, this is a very sad one. So in 2011, Carmen Ortiz, which was the U.S. Attorney's Office, charged SWARTZ for hacking into the MIT computer network to download millions of JSTOR articles. The thing you need to know is that this was an act of civil disobedience meant to basically protest the restricted access to research funded by taxpayers. But I don't think he knew what could have happened in the end because of it. So the U.S. Attorney brought charges that carried a maximum penalty of 35 years in prison. I want you to understand something. He was facing 35 years in prison for one act. One thing you need to know is that a first-degree murder in this country is a minimum of 25 years. Aaron SWARTZ was not hurting anyone, but yet he was looking at 35 years in prison. Not just that, but $1 million in fines. And they were able to do that because the way that the CFA is written, that they can stack on top of stacking. And that is the problem here. Because what happened was that it was a 17-month legal battle that he was dealing with, and there was no set trial date at all. And so through SWARTZ's perspective, it must have been so overwhelming. Imagine that your life right at that moment, you have no control of it. And you're being used to set an example. But they don't understand is that when you use someone by an example, you are damaging that person for the rest of their life. Not just that, but the people around them. So every time someone is using a hacker for basically to demonstrate this is what will happen to you if you do this, I cannot say this even stronger than anything ever, is that you're being a horrible person because you do not know what that's going to be for other people. Using people as an example to show how bad this can be for you if you do these things, there's no heart in that. And that's the problem here. Because the unfortunate bit, because of this situation, using him as an example to set the scene, it cost him his life. He hung himself in his apartment on January 11th, 2013. Of course, they dropped the charges, But you can't, how do you go to a family and be like, we dropped the charges? His family pretty sure stated that it was because of this situation that he decided to take his own life. How do you go to a family and basically be like, I dropped the charges, we're sorry about your loss? When in reality, they were the reason for it. They pushed him way over the end. He had no future at that moment in his life. So he took his own control, the only control that he had left at that very moment, and he took his own life. It's his story that still motivates many of us to keep fighting for rights. It's his story that pushes for reform to occur. And it's his story that basically wanted to change the situation. So Aaron's Law, which was created in 2013, was a response to this. But it didn't pass, unfortunately, because there were some major tech companies with some really big pockets that were lobbying heavily to make sure it didn't pass. But the thing is to note is that it would have changed the phrasing of it. So instead of just saying like exceeds authorized access to access without authorization, just keep it very simple. That permission was granted or that it wasn't exploited. The other thing is that allowing those stacks to stop doing it. Where if they did one crime, they only are charged with one crime, not multiple crimes for that one act. Because that's what was going on with him. And we see that all across the world when hackers are being prosecuted, is that these things are being stacked against them and they spend a long time in prison or a huge amount of money as well to pay for the penalties. And this seems really terrible. Now, besides the CFA, you need to know about the DMCA, even though I don't know of any cases of any hacker being prosecuted used with this. But the thing is to note is that the DMCA basically puts in that reverse engineering is seen as a breach of companies. And this gives the rights for companies to come after you if you basically do something to their product that it wasn't designed to do or something they don't like you to do. It does create a chilling effect, so it's important to note about them. Now, with improvements to legislation, we can change where we stand today. Imagine every single company around the US had disclosure policies. Like it was embedded that if you are practicing any business, that your compliance checklist had to include a vulnerability disclosure policy. Wouldn't that be amazing? That bilateral trust amongst organizations and hackers could finally close that gap, and we could work so much stronger than ever before, that we could prevent attackers from doing so much damage that they do right now. But also, not just that, it would encourage more good hacking in this country, and we need that. Because I tell you, there are people out there that do want to practice better hacking and whatnot, but the problem is that they're only seen exactly the same by the public. And so the shifting over, it's not logically sound for them to switch over. But I do want to say once again that those are the people that feel guilty about what they do. The ones that, wake up in the middle of the night and are freaking out. The thing is that there are people out there that don't feel guilty about the crimes that they commit. They don't feel guilty if they steal money. They don't feel guilty of taking personal data and selling it. They don't feel guilty at all. And those I will always frame as attackers, because you got to have a conscience, I would say, to be a hacker. But I want to talk more into influence in the public cycle, because in reality is we want to get rights for hackers, we have to work with these three groups. Organizations, we need them to have disclosure policies and to push for disclosure policies, but also to help try to bring in the conversation for legislation to do some sort of reform. But also we need the media to join us, because we cannot change the public's perception of who we are unless the media starts reporting correctly. Reporting, the right terms, hacker or attacker. Which one is it? You gotta be very specific. Also changing the imagery. Not all of us wear hoodies 24/7. I love a hoodie, but I don't walk outside with a hoodie. The thing is that's the whole thing, is that the public has a weird perception of who we are. They think they know us, but they really don't, because they've never heard our story. And so that's why it's important, is that we have to work with the media, organizations, and legislation to change where we stand at this point. But the good news is that we can do that. And here are some simple things. The first thing, we need to change the language and imagery of what's being reported in InfoSec. We need to work with the media. Remember, the media is our friend. They don't know the difference. So we have to tell them the difference, but kindly. I want to just reiterate that. Be kind. You do not know where they come from, or you've never been in their shoes before. They don't know better. So we have to be kind when we correct them. We also need society to notice the everyday heroes. We need people to hear our stories. If they saw our images, like those YouTube videos, like in that example with the person with pink hair, think of how many people we can change of their perceptions of who we are. We can challenge their socially constructed beliefs. Granted, we can't change everyone because, like I said, if you were someone who's insecure about yourself or you don't like being wrong, you're going to have a hard time doing that. But at least then you could get the people around that person to start pushing that person in the right direction. See, social engineering. Also, we need organizations to have vulnerability disclosure policies. I'm sorry, at the end of the day, every organization should have one. It's important because then we avoid situations from occurring, which hurts both parties. We also need representatives to update today's legislation. The thing is, like I said, they don't know too much about cybersecurity, and because they don't, we're still running into the situation. But the first step that you can take right at this moment is go to that website and sign that petition. This petition basically is everything that I talked about and how all of us need to understand that we need to change something. So go ahead and sign it, share it with your friends and family. You don't have to be a hacker to sign this. It's anyone out there who believes that we should have rights. That is for you. Now, the thing to note is that when this petition kicked off at the end of February, I wanted to take action. And because I was like, okay, I don't want to just do the talk, I want to take action. And so I need to find someone, a partner in crime, to help me on this front. So I came across Hacking is Not a Crime, which was basically this guy named Brian, and he created a bunch of stickers, Hacking is Not a Crime, based around the skateboarding image. And so I would see these at conferences. So I reached out to them saying, hey, do you want to partner on something? Because I created this petition and I think you and I are aligned on this. I didn't know it was Brian at the time. I didn't know it was just Brian doing everything at the time. So we got on the call and we started talking and we decided, let's partner up and let's bring actions here now. So Hacking is Not a Crime was born recently. And so hackingisnotacrime.org, you can visit the website. What we're trying to do is change the public perception of the hacker community. But not just that, but also to change our current legislation by working with organizations and politicians to bring about a change. The other thing you should know is that we just launched a project that you can participate called #HackerStories. And you can see this on Twitter on our handle, which is #HackNotCrime. And in it is basically people starting to do their own YouTube videos, basically 2 to 8 minutes of them talking to the camera, telling what it's like to be a hacker, the good and the bad with it, and why we need a change. And those are the stories that we need to get out there in public. Not just that, we've also been contacting various large media outlets to correct them on their terminology and their imagery. And we've had some great conversations so far. And next step is talking with legislators. So you can get part of it, by the way. We're always looking for volunteers and advocates. So if you're interested, reach out. The second step to note is that anytime you see the press reporting hacker instead of the term attacker, let them know. Remember, be kind when doing it. And we see this happen a lot on Twitter. So if a news outlet basically has a story about an attacker doing something terrible, a hacker in the community does respond and retweets it out and also like DMs them, letting them know, hey, you got it wrong. This is a correct term. These terminology, it's important for you to understand because it's hurting us in the community because it's preventing us from getting rights. So that's one thing you could do. Also, if you're someone who talks to the press, always let the reporter know the difference between a hacker and an attacker. So when they're writing and drafting the story, they have a better idea of how to actually write it in a way that is a lot more reflective of also the hacker community. The third step that you can do is make sure that every company that you work at or organization you partnered up with have a vulnerability disclosure policy set. Because vulnerability disclosure policies basically opens the door for communications between hackers and organizations to be more secure. Because without vulnerability disclosure policies, the thing you need to know is you already know all the other stuff. But something you should note is that not every security team is going to catch every vulnerability. And that's the reality of it. You're not always going to catch things. So sometimes you have to rely on the outside world to help. And it's always good to do that, because when you rather find out about your disclosure from a hacker, someone who's trying to do it in good faith, versus an attacker who doesn't tell you at all and then utilizes it for their own gain, that's why you need vulnerability disclosure policies. It's a lot better communicative form of making sure you have that door open for hackers to report something. And if you're an organization that's like, well, we can't do that, because if we do that, then we're going to get more attention to ourselves, and they're going to do a lot of things, and we don't want to deal with that. I hate to tell you this, but that is a false claim. The reality is that anytime someone goes to your website, they're looking for vulnerabilities. Whether or not you are stating that you allow disclosure, they're already looking for it. So it's better in your interest to just do it at this point. Also, if you are working at an organization that wants to push for hacker rights, connect with us, because we are working with other companies, because we need to work with companies to change legislation, believe it or not, and also to change people's perception of the hacker community. The fourth step that you can do at this time is contact your local representatives. Know who your local representatives are, because it's so important, is that we have to let them know they need to update their current legislation, because it's hurting you, not just you, your family, your friends too, because if anything happens to you, who is that going to impact? Exactly. So it's important that we start talking about it. And you could set up a call basically with them, but remember the end goal isn't telling them how to do their job. The goal is to find out what is the thing that they've been wanting to fix, and how can the hacker community help them with that. So you want to find a common ground of pain to help each other out. Don't go at this alone. If you have set up an appointment with your legislator, contact me or Hack Not Crime on Twitter, DM us, or email us from hackingisnotacrime.org's website. You can put it in, you can send a contact, and we will join you on that call, so you're not by yourself. Don't go by yourself on anything. In reality, whenever you have to change something, you need to have more presence in the room or the virtual room. Also keep a note of the Van Buren case, because the Van Buren case is going to be revisited, not revisited, it's going to be visited on November 30th at this time. Of course, that might change because of the election that's going on. But the thing you need to know is that this is the first time in a long time the CFA is going to be revisited. But the thing to note about it is that under this expansive interpretation of the CFA for this case, it would become a federal crime anytime a person violates a website's term of services. Violating terms of services is a crime. You need to understand this. This is the most important part right now. Private companies then get to decide who goes to prison and for what, which then puts us at a huge risk for everyday online behavior. So it's really important is that we keep an eye on it. And if you want to get involved to make sure, you know, we have a voice in the hacker community when this is happening, reach out. The fifth step that you can do is always volunteer your time or resources to support I Am the Cavalry, Disclose.io, CERT Coordination Center, also known as CERT CC, EFF, and CTI League. These are great organizations that are trying to change the situation that we're in, or to provide some sort of rights or advocacy for you. So the main takeaways from all this is that hackers deserve protection and rights, period. It should not have taken this long to even have this type of conversation. This should have happened a long time ago, and it has been. But the thing is, we haven't been able to move more forward. But now is the time for us to move forward. We need to update our current language and also our imagery that's being used by working with the media. We also need to work together to change public perception, because we got to influence organizations, legislators, and the media. So working together is a beautiful thing. And that's why hackersnotcrime.org exists, because it's a grassroots effort to change the situation. But of course, with as much empathy as possible too. Feel free to sign and share that petition, push for change, share this talk. These are all things that you can do right now. Also, go to hack.crime on Twitter. If you want to follow, find out what we're doing in our latest things. Also get involved. We're looking for volunteers and advocates. But I just want to first remind you once again, over and over, because it's so important, is that change starts with you and me. And we cannot give up on this fight, because I never, ever, ever want to read another story that's similar to Aaron Swartz. And I'm sure you don't either. I think it's about time that we start being a lot more protective of the people in our community, but also being part of the community to work together to bring about a change. So thank you guys so much for existing. Thank you for catching my talk. Thank you for having me here give this talk. It's really important that we do. And if you have any questions, I am here to answer any of your questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But if you want to, you feel free to DM me at any time. Also, my DMs are always open on Instagram and on Twitter, and also feel free to follow. Any questions?
I was watching your talk and I realized I was dressed wrong, so I ran and changed. But no, seriously, that was a great talk, Chloe, and very timely. You know, I was on the board, advisory board for Hackers for Charity for a long time, and you know, one of the things that Johnny Long and us always struggled with was, how do you take the name hacker back? And Johnny had spoken about that many times, you know, and there's no more compelling story about hacking than his story of how he started his mission in Uganda, you know, and how he used hacking to support that charity over there. And, you know, so many times I would wear a I Hack Charities t-shirt into a restaurant, and, you know, the conversations that those would start was always interesting and engaging. But, you know I personally loved your talk, and I think it was very timely and very necessary for the community.
Thank you. And you did make a valid point. It's very hard to take back a name that you want to use or a label, but we've seen it happen throughout history. For myself, for example, my family is Iranian, but the thing is that we don't support the regime at all. We left before the revolution and during the revolution because we don't want to have anything to do with that government. So we use the term Persian. So you may hear this, is that Iranians will use the term Persian instead of Iranian to reinstate that they supported the, they don't support the regime at all and what has happened. So it's always important to note is that you can always reclaim a title, a name, or whatnot. It's simply just taking the first step forward by doing it that way.
Well, we really appreciate your talk and enjoyed having you with us, and look forward to maybe having you here in person next year.
I hope so too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.